They were never meant to come back alive. Their role was to charge forward, shout, and die. Whether it was pilots deliberately crashing their planes into enemy ships or soldiers holding grenades against their own bodies, Japan's wartime troops were conditioned to give up everything, including their own lives, without hesitation. But what drove them to such extremes? The answer lies in a long history of cultural beliefs, military indoctrination, and battlefield methods that turned dying into a virtue and survival into disgrace. To understand why Japanese soldiers were trained to face death head-on, we have to look back centuries before World War II, deep into the traditions of the samurai. At the core of these traditions was the Bushido Code, an honor system built on loyalty, obedience, and choosing death over dishonor. By the 1930s, as Japan expanded its military power, the government took this old code and reshaped it into a state-imposed ideology. What was once a personal moral path became a compulsory belief system taught in schools and drilled into military recruits. Soldiers were taught that surrender was the worst possible shame, staining not just themselves but also their families, their ancestors, and even their emperor. To fall in battle while crying out, "Long live the emperor," was seen as the highest proof of loyalty. This mindset wasn't a suggestion, it was enforced from the moment recruits arrived. Training was merciless, designed to strip away individuality and harden them for death. New soldiers were beaten by superiors, made to swear oaths of devotion, and pushed through mental conditioning that glorified dying above all else. One general told his men flatly, "You must not return alive." Manuals warned that capture was worse than execution. Propaganda painted Allied troops as monsters who would torture any prisoner. In such an environment, the fear of bringing shame outweighed the fear of dying. By the time Japan plunged into war with the Allies, this death-focused doctrine was standard policy. Officers carried swords not just for ceremony, but to kill their own men if they showed fear or reluctance. Suicide assaults with no hope of survival became a regular tactic. Even the act of screaming while dying was trained. It was meant to frighten the enemy and prove unshakable loyalty. One of the most terrifying forms of this doctrine was the banzai charge. Large groups of soldiers would rush fortified Allied positions, bayonets fixed, grenades ready, shouting the emperor's name. From the outside, it looked senseless, but to Japanese commanders, it was a calculated sacrifice, buying time, slowing the enemy, and keeping up the image of Japanese invincibility. The men taking part rarely expected to live. They often received only enough food for one day and wrote farewell letters before the attack. The screaming was deliberate, both to steal their own courage and to shock their enemies. For the attackers, it was a final emotional release. For the defenders, it was a nightmare. One American Marine described hearing the shouts and wails before being overrun, comparing it to fighting the dead. These charges almost never succeeded militarily and cost Japan massive losses in battles like Saipan, Peleliu, and Tarawa. But the aim wasn't victory, it was dying in a way that fit the ideal. Soldiers who hesitated could be shot by their own officers, and the wounded often killed themselves rather than be taken prisoner, sometimes using grenades on themselves or injured comrades. As Japan's defeats mounted late in the war, this obsession with dying only intensified. Death became almost ceremonial. Troops were trained to treat it as a public display of loyalty. Loud and violent, perhaps the most notorious example of this was the kamikaze attacks. These pilots were sent to crash directly into enemy ships in planned suicide missions. There were no parachutes, no return routes. Chosen for their youth and supposed purity of spirit, they were told their mission was a sacred honor for their families. Before leaving, many drank ceremonial's sake, wrote parting poems, and posed for photographs, smiling despite knowing they would never return. Government propaganda painted these missions as romantic acts of sacrifice, but the truth was often darker. Many pilots were pressured or shamed into agreeing, and refusal could destroy their careers and disgrace their families. Some who tried to refuse were threatened with death. One pilot, whose mission failed due to mechanical problems, admitted he felt humiliated for surviving. Even in their final moments, these pilots were told to shout as they dove toward their targets, not just to express passion but to unnerve the enemy. Some were instructed to yell banzai as they struck, and a few even broadcast their dying cries over the radio. The psychological effect on Allied forces was profound. Sailors described the helpless feeling of watching a plane roar toward them, knowing the pilot wanted to die. It wasn't only the explosion that was terrifying, it was the sight of someone willingly ending their own life to kill you. By the time the war ended, over 3,800 kamikaze pilots had lost their lives. They destroyed over 30 Allied vessels and damaged many more, yet the strategic outcome was far from worth the loss. For Japan's leaders, this didn't matter. Winning was not the point, sacrifice was. The belief was that enough noble deaths could make the Allies reconsider their advance. Instead, it had the opposite effect, strengthening Allied determination. As Japan's control over Pacific territories crumbled, it became clear that surrender was not only condemned but nearly outlawed. Soldiers were often ordered to die with honor, many keeping grenades ready. Not to attack the enemy, but to end their own lives if taken prisoner. On islands such as Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima, entire units chose death over laying down arms. This behavior was not born purely from loyalty, but from relentless, state-imposed, psychological conditioning. Leaflets warned troops not to disgrace their families through capture. And they were constantly reminded that dying in battle, or by their own hand, was the only acceptable end. This ideology spread beyond the military. On Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would commit atrocities, jumped from cliffs after U.S. troops arrived. Mothers leaped while clutching their children. Fathers set fire to their own homes, and loudspeakers blared calls for death over surrender. Soldiers even encouraged civilians to end their lives, sometimes handing grenades to women with instructions to detonate them while embracing their children. One soldier, before leading a group to leap from Banzai Cliff, told them that an honorable death was a beautiful thing. Within the military, this thinking led to officers executing men who hesitated in carrying out suicidal orders. Some soldiers carried written oaths pledging to fight to the very end. Many refused to retreat, even when overwhelmed, staying in caves and bunkers, tossing grenades and firing blindly until buried under rubble. Capturing or being captured was rejected outright. One Japanese officer told Allied interrogators, "They're not taught to live after defeat." This uncompromising mindset fueled the extreme brutality of the Pacific Campaign. U.S. commanders quickly realized surrender from Japanese forces was rare enough to be nearly non-existent. As a result, weapons, like flamethrowers, explosives, and grenades became the standard means to clear defenders who refused to yield. The knowledge of such tactics only deepened Japanese determination to die violently rather than give in quietly. The longer the war dragged on, the more theatrical and frightening these last stands became. Young boys, many still in their teens, were molded from childhood to view dying for the emperor as the ultimate calling. Long before they were soldiers, they were already conditioned for self-sacrifice. School lessons idolized those who had died in battle, portraying such deaths as joyful and serene. Children learned that sacrificing one's life for the nation meant achieving immortality. This indoctrination began in kindergarten and carried through to their late teens. By age 16 or 17, many believed the greatest honor was to die shouting praises to the emperor. In the later stages of the war, Japan drafted increasingly younger recruits. Teenagers fought on Okinawa, some given outdated rifles or even bamboo spears, and ordered into suicide squads to attack American tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies. An American Marine remembered facing them, describing their screams, wild eyes, and a mix of fear and devotion. At home, schools became training grounds for war boys practiced bayonet drills in playgrounds and rehearsed mock death charges, while girls were taught nursing and, at times, trained for suicide attacks. When American bombing raids reached the mainland, high school students were sent to military factories and told to die if the facilities were invaded. Lessons included how to kill enemy troops with simple farming tools. As defeat loomed, plans emerged for a nationwide suicide defense, where every citizen, armed with bamboo spears, would die rather than live under occupation. By mid-1945, Japanese radio openly instructed the population to prepare for collective death. Millions of bamboo spears were handed out, and propaganda urged mothers to kill their children before taking their own lives when the Americans arrived. This was not an empty threat, it was official policy. Even after losing Okinawa, Japan's military hoped to cause such horrific Allied casualties that it might secure a negotiated peace, a plan that required both soldiers and civilians to embrace death willingly. In this grim worldview, death was not a tragic outcome, but the central objective. Charging the enemy while screaming was more than an act of courage or intimidation, it was a final declaration of loyalty and control. Proof that one's life belonged entirely to the emperor. When the war ended, those who survived, especially those who had been trained to die, were left with deep, lasting wounds. Some kamikaze pilots who lived because of weather, mechanical failure, or the war's sudden end were consumed by lifelong shame, shunned by their communities for failing to complete their mission. Others struggled to find work, carrying the weight of survivors' guilt and the knowledge that their country had deemed their lives expendable. One former pilot admitted in a rare interview, "They taught us that death was beautiful, but they didn't teach us how to live." Survivors of banzai charges and suicide missions lived in a strange space between being honored and being treated as ghosts. Constant reminders of a war lost. Many stayed silent about their pasts, while others, unable to reconcile their survival with the deaths of their comrades, ended their own lives in peacetime. Japan's treatment of those who died in its service was tangled in contradictions, shaped by tradition, propaganda, and the unhealed wounds of war. One of the most striking symbols of this complexity was the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Here the spirits of fallen soldiers were enshrined for eternal honor. But among them were men who had flown kamikaze missions and even those convicted of war crimes after the conflict ended. This created deep divisions in how the dead were remembered. Were they noble martyrs who gave everything for their country? Were they victims, sacrificed by an imperial system that manipulated them into dying? Or were they simply young men caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, coerced into an ideology they had little power to resist? In the years following Japan's defeat, cities in ruins, its people reeling from the atomic bombings, these questions lingered like shadows over a nation trying to rebuild. The process of reckoning was slow. In the decades after the war, memoirs began to surface from former soldiers who painted a disturbing picture of what military indoctrination had really looked like. Men recalled being physically beaten for crying in training or for showing hesitation during practice suicide drills. They described a system designed to erase individuality, to replace fear with obedience, and to plant the idea that the highest purpose in life was to die for the emperor. Some of those who survived became outspoken critics, saying they had been misled into believing their deaths could change the course of the war. Others kept silent, too ashamed or traumatized to speak. Despite Japan's post-war constitution renouncing armed conflict, the depth of the suicide doctrine was not widely taught to younger generations for many years. School textbooks glossed over the darkest parts, preferring to focus on Japan's recovery and economic rise rather than the psychological conditioning that had pushed entire generations toward self-destruction. Public conversation about the emotional and spiritual scars of the war became more open only decades later, but the images from those years never faded. Men sprinting into gunfire with grenades clutched in their hands. Teenagers guiding their planes into enemy ships. Mothers holding children as they leaped from cliffs. These acts were never just about dying. They were about dying in a way that was unforgettable, dramatic, and seen as an ultimate display of devotion. The kamikaze program was perhaps the most infamous example, officially called the Tokotai, or Special Attack Units. It targeted young men, barely adults, and ordered them to fly directly into enemy warships. There was no return plan. These missions were wrapped in ceremony to make them seem honorable and even beautiful. Pilots were dressed in crisp uniforms, given white headbands as symbols of purity, offered small cups of sake, and told to write farewell letters to their families. Propaganda cameras captured them smiling and joking with one another, as if heading to a glorious destiny, but behind those smiles was often fear. Many were quietly terrified. Some even wept in secret. One pilot who survived when his plane malfunctioned later admitted, "We were told our lives meant nothing, that Japan was already gone, and our death would be a final gift." By the later years of the war, volunteering was little more than a formality. Officers used relentless pressure, guilt, the threat of shame, and the fear of disgracing one's family to force boys as young as 17 into suicide missions. The decision was rarely a matter of true choice. These young men were sent out in outdated planes, stripped of armor, burdened with heavy bombs, and tasked with hitting targets that were already well defended. Most knew the Americans had developed effective ways to shoot them down before they could get close. Even so, the Japanese military invested heavily in the program, convinced that the psychological effect on the enemy was worth the human cost. More than 3,800 pilots would die this way, sinking or damaging over 400 Allied ships. Strategically, it didn't stop the war, but emotionally it left a mark. American sailors and Marines spoke of the dread that gripped them when a plane dove from the sky, not just because of the damage it could cause, but because it was being flown by someone who had chosen or been forced to die. The thought that an enemy was willing to give up his life purely to kill you could shake even the most hardened veteran. Some pilots were told to shout banzai into their radios as they made their final dive, using their voices as a weapon to unsettle the enemy. It was a final act of psychological warfare, reinforcing the image of an opponent who valued death over life. Those who failed their missions or were shot down often received no further recognition. The ceremonies that had once celebrated them were forgotten as quickly as their usefulness ended. This obsession with dramatic death was not limited to the skies. On land, banzai charges became the ultimate act of desperation. These were frenzied assaults, often carried out when ammunition was gone or positions were hopeless. Soldiers would rise from cover, sometimes in the hundreds, and rush enemy lines while screaming as loudly as they could. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy's senses through noise, speed, and sheer numbers rather than through careful tactics. On islands like Saipan, Peleliu, Guadalcanal, such charges often took place at night. Soldiers would emerge from the jungle with painted faces, charging into machine gun fire with bayonets and grenades. Survivors of these attacks spoke of the terrifying sound, a mix of human voices, drums, and the crashing of weapons in the dark. Even dying soldiers were expected to keep shouting until their last breath, using their voices to draw attention, create confusion, and inspire those behind them to keep moving. Silence in death was considered shameful. Rage and noise were considered a contribution to the fight. This idea had roots in samurai tradition, where the death yell, or ki, was seen as a release of spiritual energy, a way to defy the enemy, and an honorable farewell to life. The Imperial Army took this concept and turned it into military policy. In some cases, soldiers who died quietly were said to have dishonored their families, and the families could be denied military benefits. By the war's final months, the practice of screaming at the point of death was institutionalized. It was no longer just a habit of the battlefield. It was expected, trained, and enforced. Yet this also revealed the truth of Japan's situation. When death became the goal and noise became the strategy, the war was already lost. After the surrender in August 1945, there was no sweeping national debate about the morality or consequences of such tactics. Instead, a heavy silence settled over the country. Survivors, whether they were soldiers, pilots, or civilians, were left with confusion, trauma, and in many cases, neglect. The government's priority was rebuilding cities and the economy, not healing the minds of those who had been taught that their highest value lay in dying. The stories of suicide training, death oaths, and final screams were rarely told. Textbooks brushed past them. Many families mourned in private, with little public acknowledgement. Monuments to suicide fighters still stand, but they are often visited more by tourists than by Japanese citizens. The official narrative typically leaves out the psychological abuse that drove teenagers into the arms of death. Some survivors tried to tell the truth. In the 1970s and 1980s, former kamikaze pilots published memoirs detailing the fear, manipulation, and coercion they endured. Others broke down in interviews, describing the faces of friends they watched die. One veteran, when asked if he regretted living through the war, answered quietly, "Every day, because they told us we were cowards if we came back." Many never spoke at all, carrying their experiences silently until their deaths. Even today, the subject remains delicate. Within Japan, the legacy of these deaths is wrapped in a mixture of sorrow, shame, and denial. For historians and storytellers, the challenge lies in honoring the individuals, many of them scared young men, without excusing the system that demanded their lives. These soldiers were not all fanatics. Many were frightened, trapped in an ideology that gave them no choice but to meet death head-on. Understanding their screams means understanding the desperation of a nation at war with reality itself. When a culture turns death into a duty and the act of screaming into a calculated weapon, the loss is not measured only in lives, it is measured in the erosion of humanity itself. In the end, these men did not only die for their country, they were shaped, pressured, and sometimes broken by a belief that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. They were not simply warriors of a past age, but sons, brothers, and friends whose final moments were spent in fire and noise. Remembering them is not about glorifying their deaths, but about seeing them as people caught between loyalty and survival who remind us how dangerous it is when a nation convinces its people that life itself is expendable. Their voices have long since fallen silent, but the echoes of their final cries still carry a warning for every generation that